While researching his book, The Prohibition Hangover, Alcohol in America from Demon Rum to Cult Cabernet, Garrett Peck began giving temperance tours of historic sites in Washington, D.C. Book TV joined Mr. Peck to learn how the temperance movement led to Prohibition in 1920 and why Prohibition was repealed in 1933.
First of all, what is Prohibition and how did we get it?
Prohibition was started actually in January 16th, 1920, once the 18th Amendment was ratified, but it was actually part of a century-long movement to ban alcohol in this country. That movement was called the Temperance Movement. The idea behind there, initially temperance meant to moderate one's drinking, but by the 1820s, the movement decided that people had to abstain completely from alcohol. This was actually led by the evangelical Protestant churches, starting in the 18 teens, and they believed that alcohol was sinful, it was wrong. They called it Demon Rum. They associated alcohol with the devil, and therefore everybody had to stop drinking altogether. This movement lasted a century long. Their idea was to clean up and sober up American society and eventually end up with a decent, middle-class, largely white-based Protestant American society. And ultimately, they got their way in Prohibition itself, which was the constitutional amendment, the 18th Amendment, to ban alcohol in America, and that went into effect in 1920. Prohibition itself only lasted less than 14 years because of extreme civil disobedience to the law of the land, and a lot of violence here from organized crime, and I think extreme indifference here from the American public here. They didn't really realize what they had gotten into here by signing up for Prohibition. They thought it was simply just something that was useful to have, and then realized pretty quickly that in fact, the country has always been a drinking nation. So in a lot of ways, the temperance movement was naive to believe that people would simply just obey the law and not drink.
In your book, you seem to indicate that World War I had something to do with it.
It did, yeah. This is a really fascinating part of how the Anti-Saloon League got the 18th Amendment through Congress. And the ASL, or Anti-Saloon League, has largely been forgotten about, but they only existed for 40 years, so 1893 to 1933. They used the occasion of World War I, when the United States declared war on Germany in 1917. The largest ethnic group in the country at that time were Germans. And guess who also were the brewers? The Germans, right? So you had a whole ethnic group whose rights were basically pushed aside, right? Suddenly there was this huge anti-German hysteria in the country, and drinking beer, which is what most Americans drank at that point, suddenly looked really, really unpatriotic. So the ASL at that point then proposed the 18th Amendment, and it sailed through Congress. This was a wartime measure. People thought we needed this here for the war, and hence it went on to the states without people really even thinking about it very much. Congress voted on it very, very quickly, and it went on to the states, and all but 2 of the states ratified the 18th Amendment. Those states were Rhode Island and Connecticut, both states that had very heavy Catholic populations, who realized that Prohibition was really targeted at them because the temperance movement had a very strong nativist Protestant sentiment behind it.
Our next stop here is this striking brick church, Calvary Baptist Church.
The church itself was designed by Adolf Kloos, who built a lot of the public buildings in Washington, D.C., starting in the period of the Civil War, all the way till the late 1880s. He was a German immigrant, and he was known as the Red Architect. He was both for the red polychrome he used. You see in the church how bright red it is. And all of his buildings were that bright red, including like Eastern Market, which is probably his best known building in D.C. The other reason he was known as the Red Architect was because he was good friends with Karl Marx, the guy who wrote the Communist Manifesto. Kloos was hired in 1866 to build this church. There was a church built here 4 years before, during the Civil War, and it burned down, and then the church then hired him to build this new church. And this was the very, very edge of town at the time, and now it's in almost right downtown Washington, D.C. now, right? This is in Chinatown. We're here at Calvary Baptist Church because of a really important event that happened in the temperance movement, and that happened in 1895. And that was that the Anti-Saloon League had its first national convention here in this building. The Anti-Saloon League was only formed 2 years earlier by a congregational minister known as Howard Russell out of Ohio, and he recruited a college senior named Wayne Wheeler. Wheeler became the ASL's general counsel, and he was, I like to call him the Karl Rove of his day. He was the guy who invented pressure politics. So the way how the ASL was going to squeeze these different politicians to force them to vote dry as opposed to voting wet. So they met here in this building in 1895 and began to craft a national strategy of how the ASL was going to turn the country dry. One of the things that they decided that they were going to do was to go after the states first. And by the states, they got the states to allow local option laws. Once there was a local option law in place, that meant then that the church allies of the ASL, and these were evangelical Protestants, could use their political influence and force the counties to go dry. And hence you see that especially across the Deep South still to this day, and parts of the Midwest, you still see a lot of dry counties. That's because of the strong emphasis, or the strong influence, I should say, of the Southern Baptist Convention. Once enough states had voted to put some kind of dry law in place, that would then force the congressmen from that state to vote dry. Even if they were wet in their personal lives, the senators and congressmen would have to vote dry. And so by 1915, the majority of the states had some kind of prohibition already on the books. You know, here in Washington, D.C., we had prohibition in 1917. So before we even got into World War I, the city was already ostensibly dry. Never actually was, but but legally it was dry. So the idea of, gosh, should we change the Constitution to ban alcohol? Well, that didn't really seem so far-fetched, right? The majority of states were dry or had some kind of dry law in the book, and therefore, it seems to be the political will of the country that we should dry up the country entirely. Again, the ASL used the occasion of World War I. Once the Germans once we declared war in Germany, and the Germans, who were the biggest ethnic minority in the country, and also the brewers, were pushed aside, that led then the ASL to propose the 18th Amendment. Some of the interesting things here about the temperance movement itself, it was really a evangelical white Protestant movement. This was a faith-based initiative to get the country to dry up. And this was part of a time in American history, especially the 1890s till about 1920, known as the Progressive Era, this idea that society can be reformed. And actually a lot of good stuff came out of this era. Women got the vote, we got our food laws, we got the income tax, so, well, if that's a good thing or not, we all have to decide on our own. But yeah, we also got prohibition, and of course that actually backfired horrendously against the temperance movement itself. But this was, nearly a 3-decade-long period where we thought we can actually have a socially pure society. This is for the benefit of all Americans here to clean things up. At the same time, of course, because it was so Protestant-led, it really violated a lot of the rights of ethnic minorities. And remember, starting with the Irish in the 1840s, there was this great wave of Catholics who came into this country. Half the Germans who came to this country were Catholic. And then you had the Italians coming here, and a huge wave of Jews from Eastern Europe, and so on. And these people acted differently, and they brought their drinking habits with them. And in a lot of cases that violated what the temperance movement thought what it meant to be a good American. In this country here, we don't drink. We're middle class, proper, decent people, and you Catholics, you need to behave. So a lot of cases here, the temperance movement was really targeted at the Catholics to try to reform their ways. Prohibition actually went into effect a year after the 18th Amendment was passed, and so that went into effect on January 16th, 1920, so 90 years ago. On the eve of Prohibition, all the dries in the country were all a little bit sullen. You had, one last chance to go out and buy alcohol, unless you lived in a dry state, and the majority of states were already dry at that point. Down in Norfolk, Virginia, there was a mock funeral for John Barleycorn, led by a man named Billy Sunday. He was an evangelist and former baseball star. And at this mock funeral, he preached the eulogy. In this eulogy, he said, "Goodbye, John. You were God's worst enemy and the devil's best friend. Farewell. I hate you with a perfect hate, and by the grace of God, I love to hate you."
The arguments against prohibition are as weak as soup made on the shadow of the chicken of stars. When you compare prohibition at its worst with the saloon at its best, prohibition's a million times better. And the ills you would fly to by repeating the 18th Amendment are 1,000 times worse than the ones you'd fly from by leaving it, my friend, as it is.
And of course, Prohibition went into effect the next morning, but things turned out quite differently than the temperance movement had expected.
John Barleycorn. What's that?
John Barleycorn. That was an old nickname for alcohol, also known as Demon Rum.
Right. So when you're doing your tour, when you're done with the Calvary Baptist Church, what's next?
We go next here, we jump on the subway and go to Calorama, where we go see the Woodrow Wilson House, and he was the president when Prohibition went in effect in